Good evening, and thank you for joining the New York Jewish Week and UJA Federation of New York for our monthly Folio series. I'm Thea Wieseltier, Director of Public Programs at 70 Faces Media, the parent company of the New York Jewish Week. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome author Ilana Kurshan in conversation with Rachel Scheinerman, editor at My Jewish Learning. Together, they'll explore Ilana's new memoir, Children of the Book, a memoir of reading together, a moving reflection on reading, Torah, and motherhood. We're especially grateful to our partner, UJA Federation, who understands the vital role of Jewish learning and values in strengthening our community. That means they're investing in Jewish summer camps, innovative Jewish education for both children and adults, JCCs and Hillels to nurture Jewish experiences in the community or on campus, and so much more. We acknowledge that in challenging times, opportunities like this get together this evening bring our community together, and it has even more relevance and meaning. With that, we turn to Ilana and Rachel to start our program. Enjoy it.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you to my colleague Thea Wieseltier for that lovely introduction, and welcome to our guest of honor, Ilana Kurshan, and welcome, of course, to all of you. We're so delighted you're here tonight to participate in this conversation and to celebrate Ilana's new book. I want to let the audience know that we welcome your questions as part of this program. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom and put your questions there. We will not read questions in the chat. We're checking them in the Q&A. So please place them there, and we will try to weave them into this interview later in the program. So Ilana Kurshan, as many of you already know, is the author of If All the Seas Were Ink, a memoir of 7.5 years in her life as it unfolded alongside her systematic study of every single page of the Talmud. The juxtaposition of her contemporary life with an ancient sacred text produced electric results, winning her the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. Ilana doesn't just write. She has also worked as a literary publishing agent in New York and Jerusalem, where she lives, as a translator and foreign rights agent, as well as serving as the books editor of Lilith magazine. She has translated books by Israeli writers Ruth Calderon, Micah Goodman, Benny Lau, Yemima Mizrahi, and others, as well as several children's pictures books in rhyme. She teaches and studies Torah as well in Jerusalem, where she lives with her husband and her 5 children. Now, those 5 children, Matan, Tagel, Liav, Shalvi, and Yitzvi, take center stage in this new memoir that we're here to celebrate, Children of the Book, a memoir of reading together. In this new offering, the 5 children's literary development, cultivated through an abundant array of books that are now mostly English language classics that are familiar to both me and Ilana from our childhoods in the 80s and 90s, weaves in these insights from Judaism's other foundational sacred text, the Torah. It's a lovely and inspiring portrait of a family reading together in multiple languages as they weather banal challenges of everyday family life, as well as complicated world events. It is ultimately not only the story of a family, but a love letter to reading, both ancient books and new. And we are so delighted to have you here, Ilana, to discuss your book. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Yes, and as Ilana knows, I've known her by reputation for a long time, but this is actually our first time getting to work together. So it's a special pleasure for me. And just again, before we start our interview, Ilana, I want to remind the audience that your questions are also welcome. Please use the Q&A function below and ask away. I and some of my lovely colleagues in the background will keep an eye on that and try and weave some of your questions into this interview. So Ilana, let's go ahead and start. But would you talk for us about how this book relates to your previous memoir? Because this is now your second memoir about your life, woven together with ancient Jewish sources and also more contemporary things that you like to read. So tell us about the relationship between the 2 books.
Sure. So I've always made sense of my life against the backdrop of the books I've been reading. And I've written about my life, whether in my journals or in blog posts, as it unfolds in dialogue with the books I've read over time. So, as you mentioned in my previous book, I wrote about the 7.5 years I spent studying Daf Yomi, a page of Talmud a day. And during those 7.5 years, as I wrote about, I got divorced, moved to Israel, dated, remarried, and gave birth to my first 3 children. And so that book really interweaves my personal life with the Talmudic texts I was learning at the time. When I published that book, a lot of people asked me if I was going to write a sequel. And I thought to myself, well, I don't want to write another book about studying Talmud. I did that already. But I do always tell the story of my life through the lens of the books I'm reading. And the books in the next period of my life as a parent of young children, which is what I write about in this book, the main texts I was reading were the children's books I read aloud to my kids, and also the Torah, which I chant from nearly every week in synagogue, and which I study with my children. So in a sense, what the 2 books have in common, they're both, I'll quote a term, they're both biblio-memoirs, which is a term I learned from Joyce Carol Oates, wrote a review in the New York Times Book Review a few years ago. It was a review of a book called My Life in Middlemarch by Rebecca Mead, about an author who read Middlemarch over and over and wrote about her life through the lens of that text. So in a sense, yes, both my books, both of my memoirs are biblio-memoirs, telling the story of my life through the lens of a text. And I structured this book according to the first 5 books of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and each part of the book is about some aspect of reading with children and a family reading together against the backdrop of the 5 books of Moses and children's literature.
Thank you. So in the book, one of the delightful things you do, and I know folks haven't gotten a chance to read it because it is just about to come out, pre-order your copies now. One of the delightful things you do is show how secular children's books sometimes resonate just really beautifully with a biblical text. So I'm wondering if you could just give folks a preview, like one example, either something from the book, or if you've got another one that didn't make it into the book, that's good too.
Sure. So I'll tell you this. So I'll give you an example. So I mentioned that each part of the 5 books of my book correspond to the 5 books of Moses. So the first part, Genesis, which I called Sunset at the Dawn of Time, that whole part of the book is about how we create the world through language for our children, or at least the beginning of that part of the book corresponding to the beginning of Genesis. And I wrote in the book about how, for many parents, one of the first books we read with our children when they're just infants, right, newborns, is a book that's usually called some variation of, like, Black and White, an accordion book. I imagine if you have hung around newborns, you know this kind of book. It's a series of black images against a white background and white images against a black background. Like a bottle, a book, a bathtub, like all familiar objects from a baby's world. And the idea is that a parent points to each of the objects in the book and says the name of that object aloud to the child. And the reason it's in black and white is because newborns can only see black and white, and they're still learning how to, make out shapes. So I read this book to my oldest child when he was a newborn. And I remember reading it to him and thinking about, well, okay, how much is he actually absorbing? How much can he actually see, right? I know that an infant can only see as far as that child's mother's face, right? And was he really able to make out anything? I knew he was soothed by the cadences of my voice, but I didn't know if he could actually really make out the shapes. At that time, he was still sleeping through much of the day and awake at all hours of the night, as newborns tend to be. And I remember thinking about how one of God's first acts in creating the world was to separate day from night and darkness from light, because only when it's possible to distinguish light from darkness can the world come into focus, which was also really true for my child, right? Only when my child could see dark and black and white could he make sense of those Black images against the white background. And I realized that it was as if each time I were reading to my son, to Matan, I was drawing back the darkness so that the light might appear distinct for him and his world might sharpen into focus. There's a famous midrash in the beginning of Breshit Rabbah about how 2,000 years before the world was created, the Torah was created, and that God looked into the Torah and created the world. And I love that idea of a book. God needed a book to create the world, just like the midrash says an architect needs a blueprint to create any sort of edifice, right? And I think that really became clear when I read to my newborn son that books are our guide to the world, and books bring the world into focus for us. And that just as God created the world by distinguishing light from darkness, I was helping to create the world for my son and really summoning the world into being through the utterances, through the words I was sharing with him in the book. So that's one of the first examples that I give.
I remember that one. And the one that stuck with me from the book was The Very Hungry Caterpillar, which most folks on this call probably have some experience because that Eric Carle is like such a well-known book. And I have also read that book many times, had it read to me, many times read it to my children. And of course, it's just like the 7 days of the story of creation that ends with a beautiful, with a period of rest and a beautiful butterfly. And I just never made the connection, but that's like a really fun one that resonated with me. More to be found in the book, of course, and I'm sure folks will enjoy exploring that when they can get their hands on the book. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what it practically looks like to read with children, because you have 5 of them, and you love to read, and they're all different ages. In the book, they range from about 2 to 11. Is that right? The oldest is about 11 in
Yes.
the book.
Yes.
These days, it's been a couple of years. These days, the book, the kids are a tiny bit older, but that's a lot happening in a family. There's always movement in my experience with lots of little kids around. And yet you manage to weave it in and day out. So give us some images of what it looks like to be a reading family day in and day out.
Well, I'll say I know that a lot of parents, right, think of bedtime as, reading time and getting into bed to read with their children. And we do that in my house, of course, but we also really read at all hours of the day. It's not because I am so big into promoting literacy. No, in our house, it's really a survival mechanism for me as a parent. I have found that the best way for me to calm my children down and to get everyone's attention is to read to them. So we read in all contexts. We have on our kitchen table a stender, like that kind of stand that you usually use for like sacred text. Like people use it to study Talmud. So we use our stender, our wooden stender, for supporting the picture books that we read at the dinner table. I know it's really important to eat with your kids. I've read all those New York Times articles about the family dinner. We do not do that. Dinner is when they eat, and I read out loud to them. But I read all through meals because it's the only way to know that my kids are actually going to shut their mouths or open their mouths to eat and not to fight with each other, not to bicker. But yeah, we read in car rides. We read all the time in our house. I always bring books with me. Now my youngest has graduated from the stroller, but when we took the stroller everywhere, the whole bottom of the stroller was always a stash of picture books that I was always rotating in and out. And whenever there was downtime, we would read. And I found that just always being in the middle of a story was a great way for all of my kids, all of us, to have our heads in the same place. And also it was a way for us to have common associations, inside jokes. I remember one time we were reading again and again. We tend to go through phases with books where we read certain books over and over again. This was definitely true of the picture book stage. And by the way, I don't believe that anyone ever graduates from picture books. I still read picture books. I still hunt down picture books. I'm in the States now for a family visit, and I spent the morning in the public library checking out picture books for my kids. That's my favorite thing. I love picture books. So we read picture books all the time. There's a picture book called Miss Nelson is Missing about a very mean, a nice teacher who dresses up as a mean substitute. Anyway, it doesn't matter so much. But there's this refrain. There's an ominous refrain in the book. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. And I remember one time we had been reading that book over and over again. And one night we were eating dinner, and suddenly, like, while we were eating, there was a knock on the door, and my then 3-year-old or 2-year-old, I don't know, said, "Suddenly there was a knock on the door." And I thought to myself, now he didn't understand what that meant, but even he just from the context knew enough to know that that was an appropriate comment, and that it would, I think also that it would be funny because we all burst out laughing, and it was just, anyway, that is to say that I think books furnish us with common associations, inside jokes. It becomes like what bonds us together as a family. And so it's something I really, really value. I also I love reading out loud. It's my favorite thing to do in my spare time. I read, I volunteer reading to the blind. When my family gets sick of me, I find other victims, one could say. But so we're really always reading out loud in our house. And it's just children's books are just the background to what's ever happening in our lives, always, at all times. It's like the soundtrack to life.
Yeah, so I also remember Miss Nilsson is Missing from my childhood. That was also a favorite for me as a child and for my children now. That is a book they love. So I think one thing that's interesting about your story is you're in sort of a unique book situation because you're an English-speaking family in Jerusalem. Right. So talk to us a little bit about what that looks like. You have kids who speak English at home and who speak Hebrew at school and learn to read Hebrew at school and are learning, as we learn in the book, learn to read English at home with you. And the access to English language books may look a little bit different.
Yeah, I guess I'll say that part of what's important to me about reading with my children, and I do read to them primarily, although not exclusively, in English. Part of what's so important to me about reading to them is that they're growing up in a very different cultural milieu than the one I grew up in. And they're learning. Oh,
Where'd
sorry. Yes, I grew up on Long Island. In the Northeast. Yes, and I've now at this point lived about half my life in Jerusalem and half my life in America, in New York, mostly in the New York area. But it was very important to me to share the books that were so formative for me in my own childhood with my children, even recognizing that what was familiar to me is not familiar to them. So, for example, I grew up reading so many books about, I don't know, growing up on the Lower East Side, and books about set in various periods during American history. And so I read a lot of those books to my children, but a lot of what was so familiar to me was very foreign to them. So, for example, I read to them the entire, the whole All of a Kind family series. I read them The Little House on a Prairie, all those books I read out loud to them. And that required a lot of explaining. I remember when I first started reading them Little House on the Prairie, they asked me, "What's a prairie?" And I tried to explain that it was like, I said it was flat land that stretches in all directions and you can't really see anything else. And one of my children immediately said, "Oh, you mean like the Midbar, like you mean like the desert that the Israelites wandered in the Torah?" And I was like, not exactly, but it was just interesting for me. It's always interesting for me to hear their frames of reference because they're often very different from my frames of reference. With All of a Kind Family, it was especially interesting because those books were really written as a way of normalizing Jewish culture for American children at the time when they were written. And I know this because I read Sidney Taylor's critical biography. At the time when they were written, there were not very many children's books available about Jewish children for American Jewish children or for American children in general. And so Sidney Taylor wrote those books to sort of so that Jewish children would have books that they could relate to at their own experiences. Whereas for my kids, the Jewish aspects of those stories were very familiar, but they didn't know who Santa Claus was or what was so special about the 4th of July or what have you. So I did a very different kind of explaining for them, not to mention like, they knew what Sukkot was, but they had never heard of Sukkot, or whatever, even just some of the terminology I had to just explain. So that was fascinating for me. So part of the experience is sharing with my children the books that instilled in me my love of reading and the hope that it will do the same for them, and sharing my passion with them. Because I really believe that if I, as a parent, am not passionate about a book, like there's no point in reading it, to my children, like I'm sharing a love with them, which is why I refuse to read to them like Captain Underpants.
I was going to say, they never make you read books you don't like. You just say no.
I try to refuse, but I will say there are a lot of books that I insist that they read to themselves, like books like The Babysitter's Club and Spy School, like all the like series books that are written to make kids fall in love with reading. I think those books are really important. And I think they have a very important role in the development of children's reading lives. But I don't think that one needs a parent for those books. I think those are the books for kids to devour on their own. I'll often start my kids off. I've read them the first chapters of many of those kinds of books. But I'll read them the first chapter. It's kind of like, giving them the push on the bicycle, and then they go off and pedal on their own, as opposed to a book like, All the Kind Family or Little Women, books that I really want to be the mediator of those books to my children, and really be to teach them something about American history, about Jewish culture, whatever it is, like that I want to be a part of that experience with them. I will say that because sometimes they read to me as well. It's not only me reading to them. Like, our reading lives have gone through many phases. Initially, of course, I was always the reader, but then when my kids were learning how to read, they would often read to me, and I was there with them as they were sounding out words and what have you. And then now that I have, my oldest is now just turned 14. So sometimes there are certain books that my kids will read and fall in love with, and they want to share them with me, and they'll read to me. This is particularly the case with this happens sometimes with graphic novels, because I'm very bad with graphic novels, because I'm just a very text-oriented person, and I never remember to look at the pictures when I'm reading.
I
And
have
so
the same problem with graphic novels.
Oh,
I think
really? That's
I didn't read them as a kid. I didn't read comics.
exactly.
I think kids who read comics learned how to toggle between picture and words, and I just read all the
Yes.
words and then realize I missed the pictures and I have to go back, and
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. And you miss out on so much of the story. I even find this with picture books, that sometimes I'm so focused on the text, but meanwhile, my children who aren't looking at the words at all, they may not even be literate yet, right? I call them illiterate, but I really should say pre-literate, right? But my illiterate kids, my pre-literate kids, they're not even they don't even see the letters. The letters are meaningless to them. They're focused on the pictures, and they're seeing something so different. And sometimes they have the most brilliant observations. Like, I remember I was reading my kids this book, The Seven Silly Eaters, which you know it. Okay, I love it. Okay, a book about a family of 7 kids, all of whom eat different foods and drive the parents crazy. Anyway, it's one of my favorite books to read aloud of all times. But my daughter noticed something that even after like the, I don't know, 50th rereading, I had never noticed, because I wasn't as focused on the illustrations, which are so detailed and beautiful. Anyway, the mother, who's overwhelmed by her 7 children and their various, their dietary needs, the mother, incompatible dietary needs, the mother, in the beginning of the book, before the first child is born, when the book begins, is playing the cello on the porch. And as the book goes on, you always see the cello languishing in the corner. And only at the very end, when, I won't give it away, but it's a picture book, so when the kids learn how to fend for themselves in the kitchen, let's just say, the mother in that last page takes out the cello again. And my daughter, at the age of like, I don't know, 7 or 8, noticed that. And I was blown away that she saw the story from the mother's perspective and empathized with the mother, and said to me, wow, now the mom can play the cello again. That's so nice. And I was like, what cello? What are you talking about? I hadn't even looked at the illustrations. I was so focused, being such a text-oriented person, on the text. So anyway, getting back to graphic novels, they have read to me a few graphic novels, which frees me to focus on the pictures in a way that I was never, on the illustrations in a way that I was never able to do before. So that's a whole different, we had that experience with White Bird. I wrote about in my book, actually. Yeah. By RJ Palacio, who also wrote Wonder. Anyway, so we've had that experience a few times, and that's also expanded my repertoire, because I would never pick up a graphic novel. So that's also been a new chapter, one could say, in our reading lives.
So I want to go back to this mother with the cello, because I think one of the things that's kind of amazing about your book is it feels like reading is your cello, and you never had to really put it down, right? You have a description early in the book where, Matan is born, you're literally in the delivery room and you're reading to him, right? So,
Yeah.
but I'm curious, like, is there a metaphoric cello that you have put aside that you are now getting back, now that, right, spoiler alert, her kids get older and they start learning to read? And is there a metaphoric cello that you are picking back up as you enter an age of parenting post-literate children, should we say?
So first of all, I
Literate
will say,
children.
yeah. I'll say it really is true that I read through all my births. I read between contractions for all my births.
Oh, just a second, Ilana, you are muted. Let's get you back.
There we go. Sorry, I had the same
There you are.
doula for all 5 of my births, and she still says to me that
That's
the best
literally inconceivable to me, but go on, tell us.
inconceivable, very funny. She said to me that the best book recommendations she ever got were the books I was reading while I was giving birth, because they had to be really good books if I could read them, while in labor. Which is true. And I remember I associate with each of my kids the book I was reading as I birthed them. Whatever, never mind. I feel like there was some hashgacha prati, like there was some divine providence involved in like the match between the book and the child that was subsequently born. Never mind. But anyway,
no, tell us about one of these matches. Give us an example.
I don't know if it's so, but I remember exactly what I was reading. Like when my oldest child was born, I was reading a book by Shirley Jackson called Life Among the Savages, which is about raising her child in a house full of books. Shirley Jackson is best known as the author of the short story The Lottery, which everyone has to read in high school, but she wrote so many incredible books. She wrote horror stories. She wrote 2 memoirs. She wrote several novels. Like she's a great writer that people don't know enough about. But anyway, so I was reading her memoir, Raising Demons. The demons are her children. And she has another one, Life Among the Savages. Again, the savages are her children. And it really became, I didn't realize how much that book was going to teach me about how much life would be upended after children entered our lives. And that was really, really just that really opened my eyes. Anyway, but never mind. The point is,
and you were in labor, so it was too late to change your mind.
There you go. No. I mean, the rabbis, the Talmud say that what you're looking at while you're giving birth, so I thought there was maybe something involved, and whatever. Anyway, or while your baby is conceived, what you're thinking about, what you're looking at, that was an idea in ancient times. So I often think about that in relation to what I was reading when I was in labor. But anyway, wait, now I'm sorry. I forgot what you asked me. Oh, what? Just remind me, you asked me.
If you had a cello,
a cello
that
right.
you were
yes,
able to pick
the
that
cello.
up.
I remember now. Okay, so the idea is, I would say that basically, there are what was sacrificed. I felt like once at first when my babies were just born, when my kids were youngest, like when I was breastfeeding them and they were too young to have opinions of their own, I would just read to them whatever it was that I was reading. So if I was reading like a, whatever it was, if I was reading an 800-page novel about gold mining in New Zealand, that's what they were listening to. And they would just slog through that book with me for however many weeks it took to get through it, But what I discovered over time was that, first of all, my kids didn't always, as they got older, they didn't always want to be reading what I was reading. And they were ready for books with pictures and images and books they could touch and chew and take in the bath with them. All the books that children read. So I had to set aside I found it very hard when life was so interrupted at all times, as it is when you're a parent of young children. I've noticed, by the way, that many memoirs of parents of newborns, of which there are many, many, and I collected them for a while, but are written in very, very, not even chapters, they're written in very short sections, almost like poetry with white space in between the sections. And I think this is not incidental. Like, I do think that you don't have sustained attention as a parent. So both your writing and your reading become very punctuated and choppy because of the nature of your life. Anyway, so that is to say that I found it much more difficult. I used to easily read at least a book a week. And if I didn't get through a novel in a week, then I got sick of the characters and was ready to move on, and I found that suddenly it was really hard to get through a novel in a week. I didn't have long Shabbat afternoons with nothing to do but read. I didn't have an hour to read in bed every night. I collapsed when I got into bed. And so what changed for me, the proverbial cello, as it were, was the long novel. I found it really hard to have the sustained attention to read the kinds of books that needed that. And what I began reading instead, I read a lot more. At first it was short stories. I read a lot more poetry. I would always keep a poetry book on the windowsill in the kitchen so that, like, while the pot was boiling, I could read a poem, or I would try to read my kids' poems, like, over breakfast. That did not really work. We got, it was more a fantasy than it wasn't really that successful. but I tried. But I would read to myself poetry, because poetry is something that you can have a satisfying literary experience in just 2 minutes, right? Which you can't with a short story or a novel. Of course, you feel like you've barely gotten anything, and then you already have to put the book down. But I will say that as I had to set the cello aside, and I have been able to pick up that cello, and I've, like, the sign of my sense of liberation as a parent, or my having arrived in the promised land of independent readers, or at least some independent readers, is that I am able to read longer books and finish them within a week, which is always generally my limit for how long I want to be with a single book, no matter how good the book is. But instead, what I picked up instead, I started doing a lot more laning, a lot more reading from the Torah. As I mentioned in the beginning of this Zoom, I read Torah almost every week, usually at least half the parsha. And that's really because of the fact that it's sort of that kind of reading has replaced the role that novel reading once played in my life, which is to say the thing that I'm always doing when I'm not doing anything else, or while I'm doing other things. Sometimes I like to say, like, I don't like to do anything in life that can't be done while reading, which is why I don't really know how to drive. I mean, I have a license, but I've never successfully driven because it's really hard to drive while you're reading. With the only exception of maybe I do like to swim. But anyway, never mind. But aside from that, I
Yeah, we
really
had a
don't.
conversation before this session about how you're not big on audiobooks, because that you
Yeah,
can
I'm
do
not.
while driving.
Yeah. That I guess that's true. But the problem is I would get so absorbed in the book that I would crash the car or something. So it's probably good that I am
Okay,
not into audiobooks.
better
No.
not.
That would be a disaster. Yeah. But anyway, the world is a safer place because I don't drive, so we shouldn't. But anyway, the point is, yeah. So I do a lot more reading from the Torah, because when you're reading from Torah, I think of it. I used to memorize poetry, and I think reading Torah is a lot like memorizing poetry in that the way you do it, the practice is, you learn a verse with the text in front of you, or a verse or two, and then you sort of repeat it over and over in your head without looking at it until you can basically do it by heart and sing it by heart. And that's very, very compatible with, it lends itself very nicely to being in the playground, where you have to look up every 2 seconds to make sure everyone's okay, or, watching your kids wherever they may be. You always have divided attention as a parent. And to be a good Torah reader, you need to sort of learn with divided attention. So it's sort of just accidental that I kind of fell into being the regular laner in our shul, like I'm the regular Torah reader, because it just worked well with my lifestyle. And I always, I don't go anywhere without a paperback. It's called a tikkun, a book to practice reading Torah from. But I will say that of late I have been able to go places both with the tikkun and with more novels, and I'm able to read a lot more to myself. I also these days read a lot. You know how they say, like, toddlers parallel play, like two toddlers play next to each other but don't necessarily interact. So I kind of parallel read with my kids. Like, I'll get onto their beds at night and, like, read my book while they're reading their book. And it's a different kind of reading together. But there's still a sense of, we're not on the same page, but it feels like a shared experience nonetheless. So that's definitely something to celebrate. I would call that also a kind of way of picking up the cello.
Nice. So I want to bring us back. You talked a little bit in the earlier about how one of the interesting things about reading these particular books with your Israeli children in Jerusalem that you read as a Long Island kid a generation ago is sharing different cultural contexts. And so we have a question in the chat about Little House on the Prairie, which actually was also something I wanted to talk about for a slightly different reason. But our participant says, what do you do about things that just don't age so well, right? So Little House on the Prairie did not age great in terms of the way it speaks about Native Americans, the way it perhaps speaks about Jews, women, other things, there are sort of two interesting things going on there, because you, like Laura Ingalls Wilder, are a memoirist, right? She's also, you're writing a selective memoir of your life. She's writing a selective memoir of your life. So, and you actually do deal with this book in this book that we're discussing today, right? So
Yes.
I'm sorry for throwing a more complicated set of observations and questions at you, but the question is sort of a twofold. Like, how do you think about books that haven't aged as well and how you read them with your children? And also, how do you think about the process of memoir, especially as you're reading other memoirs, and you say in the book that you have to talk to your kids a little bit about, what she puts in, what she leaves out, because even your kids can see in the book that it is not a historical transcript of the family life.
Yes. Yes. Oh, wow. Okay. So I'll say that with Little House on the Prairie. So my husband, Daniel, is a professor of literature. And he was really not happy when I began reading Little House on the Prairie to my kids. He said to me, what are you going to do? Or, what would you do if someone said the only good Jew is a dead Jew? How are you going to read them the sentences in this book about Indians? Like, he was very upset. And we kind of made a deal that I was going to read Little House on the Prairie to the kids, but at the same time, I was going to read to myself Laura Ingalls Wilder's the critical biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder called Prairie Fires that came out, I don't know, sometime in the last decade, maybe a little less. Anyway, yeah, I read to myself a critical biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder's, sort of looking at what in her novels was based on fact and what was not, and what choices did she make, which was a fascinating book to read in its own right, because as a child, when I read those books, I remember thinking that surely Laura wrote down everything that every single member of her family said, because there were quotation marks in the book. And if there were quotation marks, then surely Pa really said what he said, and Carrie really said what she said. I was sure that everything was documentary, for sure. And it was a real awakening for me and a very sobering experience to realize, as I continued to go through this series, wait a second, maybe this didn't happen. Maybe she took some poetic license. Could it be, right? Maybe things didn't happen exactly as they happened. And what I discovered when I was reading this critical biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder was really just, first of all, that she really wrote the books when she was desperate for money, because as an adult, because the farm had failed, she really needed to be able to support her family. And she wrote the books hoping that if her dreams of the farm hadn't come to fruition, she might be able to support her family off the memories of all her experiences, on the prairie and all their homesteads and what have you. And also, like, her father was very different from the Pa character in the book, her father's challenges. So that was very eye-opening for me. And as I read the book, I would supply a lot of commentary to my children as I was reading it to them, informed by what I was learning. And I did that with a few books that I read to them. I would read critical biographies. I did it with the Ramona books. I read two autobiographies by Beverly Cleary. I read, various. I was interested in, it was an opportunity for me in revisiting the books to gain a little more context for myself and be able to provide that context for my children. So I think that's one of the advantages of reading aloud to your kids rather than your kids reading to themselves, is that you as the parent can mediate the experience for them and comment as necessary. You can kind of be like the Rashi as they're encountering the text. I will say that in terms of the part of your question about memoir, part of what was so interesting for me as I was reading Little House on the Prairie with my kids was that it really led to my own meditation on sort of how is memoir different from autobiography. And really what I came to realize is that memoir is not about a factual documentation of experience. It's really about converting life into art and hoping that you will create something that ideally will inspire and move people. And towards that end, sometimes you take a degree of poetic license. You tell a story in a way that's going to speak to people, even if it's not in the way that things exactly happened. And part of what I did in writing this book, because my children are now a little older than they were when I wrote my previous book, and all of them were pre-literate in the previous book. In this book, it was very important to me because my children are characters in the book. I wanted them to be comfortable with the way I wrote about them. And so as I was writing this book, I would often read aloud to my children the parts in which they appeared. In fact, I pretty much read to my older 3 children. I read everything. I read every part they appeared to them aloud to make sure that I had their consent before anything went into print. And oftentimes the kids would listen and they would say, but Hima, it didn't happen that way. That's not what happened. It was Tegel who said that, not me. And I would say to them, I know, but I had to change things a little bit. And what I tried to explain to them is that as a writer, as a memoirist, you're really trying to remain true to you're trying to remain faithful to the emotional truth of the moments you're writing about, and not necessarily to the factual truth. And that's okay, that there are different kinds of truth. And I think that's also true, if we connect it back to, there are times, there's a concept in Judaism of lying for the sake of peace, right? Even God lies for the sake of peace in the story of Abraham and Sarah, and their sort of annunciation scene when they hear that Sarah's going to have a baby. Anyway, and that's not just in the Midrash; it's in the text itself that God essentially speaks a mistruth for the sake of, for the sake of for the sake of their marriage. But that is to say that sometimes we change the details. I don't write about that in the book, but I think of it often. Sometimes we change the details of what happened towards a greater end. And I didn't really, I felt comfortable doing that in my book. And I felt that in some ways the book is truer and more faithful to experience because it's faithful to those emotional realities.
Thank you. That's a really thoughtful answer. I have a couple of questions coming in about Israeli children's literature. Folks want to know, what Israeli literature for kids, like, give us a quick sketch map of what that looks like and how it's different from American literature.
Yeah, so I would say that I mostly read to my children in English, but I read a lot of fiction to myself in Hebrew. I work as a translator of books from Hebrew to English, and I also scout out books for translation into English for a literary agency. So I read a lot of books as they're newly published in Hebrew. So I love reading to myself fiction in Hebrew. My kids pretty much, I would say, read equally. I think they read equally in Hebrew and English. It depends which child. No, I don't know if I can speak to the differences in the literatures, because a lot of the literature that is published in Hebrew, there are a tremendous amount of books that are translated from English into Hebrew, and that makes up a huge component of the books you're going to see. Like if you go into a bookstore, there's Sifrut Makor and Sifrut Tirgum. They're the books that are originally in Hebrew and the books that are in translation. And you will find, I think it's fair to say, an equal amount of both. So the kinds of books that Israelis are reading, and if you look at the bestseller list in Israel, right, a lot of those books are, you'll see books like Haruki Murakami and Lessons in Chemistry, like books that are best-selling writers and authors. Sorry, those mixed author and writer, but you understand, are often the kinds of books that are bestsellers in Israel. But of course, there have also been a huge number of books, about the war we're in the midst of. A lot of books that come out. My kids have read several books. There's a whole genre of books of like heroes of October 7th and what have you, which my kids have read, books that are written for children. Of course, there are adult versions of those books as well. I would say that the books about starting school are a little different in Israel because the nature of the educational system, like there really is no there's no literacy or very little literacy oriented education before the first grade in Israel, and first grade is when everything changes. So the preschool experience is very different, and therefore the way preschool are depicted in Israeli children's books, I can always tell when a book is in translation because of that. Just the preschool experience is very different and is really much more play oriented than there's very little, if at all, academic component in preschool. So the differences are really more, I would say, nuances. I think that there's more investment in the production of books and therefore the illustrations, like the jackets of America. I don't know if people really care about this, but the jackets are generally more elaborate in American books. It's interesting to compare, but I don't know if there are any larger differences that I can speak to. My kids really read both. Yeah.
Are there any beloved books that you have had trouble getting a hold of to read to your children? Like you want to read them this book and you've had trouble laying hands on it?
So I'll say that the main way we have a really good library. The libraries in Israel are much smaller than in America. I have to say, as I alluded to earlier, my favorite thing to do on our visits to the States is to go to public libraries, and I spend an embarrassing amount of time in public libraries. I think, yeah, like I checked out. I'm not even going to go into the deal, but I'll go multiple times a day because you're allowed to check out 6 books from anyway. So I'll check out like 18 books a day because I'll go back and forth and read them. And but you mean picture books, you know. But anyway, we have a decent library, although the libraries in Israel are much smaller. Like our library is just 2 rooms in the local community center. It has a decent collection of English language books because the population in our neighborhood is very Anglo. But there are a lot of English speakers. But I will say this. It is often very hard to find the book I want to read to my children at a specific point in time, but it is never hard to find a good book to read to my children. I just have to be flexible. So usually what I do is when we're home in Jerusalem, you know, I never have trouble finding good books. So go to the library. We have book drops, like bus stop libraries, you know, where people give and take books in our neighborhood. And we have 2 in our neighborhood. I go at least twice a week, and I drop off books, I take books. I'm always finding books for my kids that I can read to them. But I also read book review. I love reading book reviews. Like I always read the New York Times book review. I read lots of book reviews. And I'm always keeping lists. I have a list for each of my kids of books I want to read. And sometimes we don't get to a book and it moves to the other kid's list because the kid has gotten older. Never mind. But I keep lists, and whenever we go to the States, I order books all the time. My kids read on Kindle. My older kids read on Kindle, so they can usually get and they also are members of the New York Public Library, the Libby system, so they can check out books on their own from the New York Public Library. They can buy books on Kindle. But in terms of like picture books and books you want to hold in your hands, I keep lists. And often what I'll do is I'll order them for my nieces and nephews, or I'll order books for my parents
In
to read to my
America.
kids in America. And then when we come, I'll abscond with them in my suitcase when we go back, or whatever it is, you know, like they're the gifts, you know. So I have my methods. But yes, it does happen that I'll read a review and say, oh my gosh, my daughter's gonna love that, or I have to read, like I have to read that to my son. Actually, just today I was going through a list of books and I was looking at them up on Amazon, and my son said it was something about like how to kill a dragon, or I forgot the title, but it had a dragon and it was a dragon on the cover.
Is
and
it
my
How to
5-year-old
Train a Dragon?
Oh, maybe it was called How to Train a Dragon. I don't
My
remember. It's
kids
not
are
a book
into
I've read.
those ones. They're after our time.
Oh, okay. Anyway, so it was on some list, and I was looking it up on Amazon, and my son came over, my 5-year-old, and was like, I really want you to read me that. And I was like, so I put an asterisk next to it in my list. You know, they just say I'm always scouting out books. And I think just being flexible and knowing, like, sometimes I joke and say, like, every book eventually washes up on the shores of our free lending library, you know, the bookstop libraries, and you just have to be patient. And you know, I always have lists in my head. I always know what books I'm looking out for. And then eventually, if you're patient enough, you know, you get your hands on everything at some point or another. Also, there are all sorts of WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups for English language lending in our neighborhood that I'm a member of. And because it's harder to get a hold of English language books, we don't have, you know, like the Amazon, you know, same day delivery. It's, you know, anyway, so we're always lending books to each other. I'm always lending books to friends and borrowing books from friends. So that's another way of getting a hold of English language books.
Okay. Would you do a little reverse for us? Would you suggest to us Israeli Hebrew books that have been translated into English, perhaps by you, perhaps by other people that folks might want to share with their children or grandchildren, depending on who you are on this call, or a neighbor, or maybe you want to read it yourself. Picture books are for everybody.
Yeah. Well, if only I had I'm not home, so I can't see my books right now, which is a huge disadvantage. But I'm trying to think of Hebrew picture books that we've loved. It's so funny because in the last 3 weeks, I've just been reading constantly English picture books. So I'll tell you this, there's a great publisher called Endless Mountains Press. I don't know where they're located. I've only met with the editors in Jerusalem. They come to Israel once a year to scout out books. But they publish a lot of Israeli literature in English translation, and I translate for them. So I've done several books for them. They have an amazing book that I translated this past year that is out. I'm not going to remember the English title. It's by Daphne Sturm, Sturm. And it's something, I'm not going to remember the title, but it's a great book. It is, and the illustrations are brilliant and add so much to the book. maybe I can send the title after, I don't remember. There's also a great series that I translated also of classic stories retold in rhyme by an Israeli author named Yirmi Pinkus, but he's translating books by canonical writers like Leah Goldberg. Anyway, it's a whole series of their graphic novels. There's one called, in Hebrew it was called Uri Kaduri, but I translated it as Eddie Spaghetti. They all have, they're great rhyming books, and those are fantastic.
Can you repeat the name of the press for folks? They're
it's called
scribbling notes right now.
Yeah, it's called Endless Mountains Press. That's what it's called. And they're independent of PJ Library. They really do their own thing and publish excellent children's literature. And I also, part of what I do as well is I scout for them, so I get to spend a lot of time in bookstores, just reading picture books as they come out. Like, that's my favorite thing to do without my kids. I go really on a research trip, a scouting mission. And I send them pictures of, like with my, cell phone camera, I'll send them pictures of sample illustrations, or sometimes I'll do just a quick sample translation for them. Because they really they have a very clear sense of what they're interested in. And most of the books, they do have some Jewish element. Of course, a lot of Israeli children's literature has nothing to do with anything Jewish, but that's primarily what they're interested in, but not exclusively. So I would look out for anything they publish for sure. Yeah.
So we also have a question from Pepita, who I have known virtually in our events for a long time. She studies Daf Yomi with My Jewish Learning, and you credits you as the inspiration for that. And she says, I'm 71 years old, so I assume that what's behind that is she does not have tiny children in the house right now. And she says, I'm wondering how this book is relevant for me.
So first of all, I think that one of the best things that grandparents can do is to read with their children. But I think what I really try to
model. You have grandparents that read to your children, right?
What's that? Oh, thank God. I will say not only do I have grandparents read to my children, but my mother essentially taught one. Yes. I read about this book. My mother essentially taught one of my daughters to read. I have twin girls, and one of them began reading much before her sister. And her sister was like, okay, reading is my sister's thing. They really define themselves in opposition to each other. So the other twin said, that's it. My sister reads. I'm not a reader. I'm not going to read. And refused to read with me and really struggled. And her sister just took off and would spend hours just lying on the couch reading book after book. And anything her sister read, she wouldn't read. And this was during COVID that all this happened. And my mother had the brilliant idea, why doesn't she read by Zoom with that daughter, because then it would have nothing to do with me and maybe she wouldn't feel threatened. And really, I credit my mother with teaching her to read, because my mother would read with her the Clementine series every day. It wasn't even after school, because there was no school. It was sort of like in place of school. But she would read with my daughter until my daughter felt comfortable reading on her own. And also she really had to find a series of her own. She wouldn't read any book her sister had read. So we really had to find her own series, because that's the age of anyway. But in terms of people who don't have children in the house,
or maybe grandchildren
in the house, I would say part of what I try to model in my book is what it means to live one's life against the backdrop of text, to always have literary references in the backdrop. And those don't necessarily have to be to children's literature. They don't necessarily have to be to Torah. They don't necessarily have to be to Talmud. But when you're always immersed in text, life is so rich. And I think this is something that both of my memoirs have in common, really trying to show that, especially, and I think this is especially true for us as Jews, we as the Jewish people, right? We don't have like a national royal palace with our crown jewels where everyone can come and see, where we don't have our Buckingham Palace, right? Where you can see like the royal crown that Queen Elizabeth wore to this famous whatever. But our crown jewels as the Jewish people are our texts. Those are our jewels. And those texts belong to all of us. The rabbis say in Pirkei Avot, there are three crowns. There's the crown of royalty. There's the crown of priesthood. And there's the crown translating, and there's the crown of Torah, right? And the crown of Torah is there. Everyone can come in and take it. And I feel like that's true. Like Torah, our texts, they're there for everyone, and we should all avail ourselves of our text because they're our treasures. So that's part of what I tried to do in my book, to show how rich life is when it unfolds against a backdrop of text.
That's beautiful. And I think that is a great place for us to end. And I hope that everybody on this call is inspired to live their life against the backdrop of text, including perhaps this text coming out this month. Ilana, has been so lovely to speak to you and get to know you. And I
Thank you.
appreciate this audience and your wonderful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to every single one. The hour goes really quickly on these events. Want to thank our partners at the UJA and, of course, my amazing colleagues at 70 Faces Media behind the scenes, making all this happen. And it was lovely to spend the evening with all of you this way. So, and to
Thank
celebrate a
you.
wonderful new book. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel. Thanks.